Welcome back, everyone, to this episode of Transrational Perspectives. I'm Noah Taylor,
My name is Sean Bryant.
and today we're beginning what is, in essence, the second season of our show. During the previous season, we introduced our perspective on peace and conflict studies and outlined briefly the main aspects of the transrational approach to peace studies.
We gave an overview of an energetic peace family, which is defined by the peace out of harmony, of moral peace families, which are often understood as peace out of an order, peace families, which are characterized by peace out of justice and security, and postmodern interpretations of peace, which are understood as peace out of multiple truths, and then transrational peace families, which are ways of understanding peace that find a dynamic equilibrium of these other aspects.
What we would like to focus on in this next season of our show is looking at specific topics. So we've chosen a few topics to go into to show kind of the contemporary face of peace and conflict studies. Some of these topics Sean and I will be exploring, and in some other topics we'll be calling in for interviews to get other people's perspectives on what they are doing in their peace research and peace practice. For this episode, we've decided to look at the issue of peace, pandemic, and conflict, which is of course a very pressing and timely issue and I think has affected most of our lives. And we want to figure out what is a peace studies perspective, or what are peace studies perspectives on the issue of peace, conflict, and pandemic. So of course, peace and health are deeply interrelated and codependent on each other. We want to understand the dynamics of these relationships between peace, conflict, and health. And what we've noticed in doing some preliminary research on peace and pandemics is that if we look at the relationship between how large-scale violent conflict and protracted social and cultural violence often leads to deleterious effects on populations' health and to the spread of pandemic diseases. We can see this in many areas where there have been large-scale violent events that disrupts the physical and cultural infrastructures, resulting in destruction of food supply lines, access to medicine, sanitation, and also the destruction of political infrastructures with the inability of certain groups to access these physical structures, and thus contributing to the spread of pandemic diseases. But what's I think is less explored is the inverse relationship, to look at what is the impact of a pandemic on peace and conflict. And so what we want to do today is to go a bit beyond the numbers that we see every day, the numbers of infections and deaths and recovery rates, and to look at some of whatever the main themes or main lenses that we can look at to understand this nexus of relationships.
So what we've chosen to look at today through that is four topics. One is globalization. Secondly is individualist versus collectivist approaches.
And our third topic, we're going to be looking at some of the ways in which a pandemic allows for the exacerbation of existing social and political fault lines to really come to the forefront. And finally, we're going to look at the idea of a pax pandemica. That is, to which ways may a pandemic actually contribute to peace?
On the topic of globalization, the idea has been floated that the 2020 COVID-19 global pandemic marks the end of globalization, and this echoes the call of the end of history by Francis Fukuyama in the 90s, of saying that the grand ideological debates of the 20th century were over. And so this question is globalization dead is a relevant topic. The one thing seems clear, that with the changes of how the world is organized right now, with things like travel for tourism being severely curtailed or stopped, that seems to be mark the end of some kind of like freedom of mobility for a large kind of global middle class. and yet there are some things that might not be actually ending, which is things like the further integration of a singular global economy.
Yep.
So, what do you think, Noah? Is globalization dead, or are there some aspects that are going to be continuing or not?
I think when we try to look at what kind of a risk or what kind of threat or problem is a global pandemic like the COVID-19 virus, I think it's intricately tied to globalization. When we look at things that are threats to the entirety of humanity, they're often divided into naturally occurring risks and anthropogenic risks. So, for example, a naturally occurring risk would be a supervolcano eruption or a stellar explosion causing havoc on Earth. And an anthropogenic risk would be something like a nuclear accident or nuclear catastrophe. What's interesting about this pandemic is that it is in between the two. Yes, it is a naturally occurring disease, but the ways in which it arose and the reasons for its spread are deeply tied to globalization. Pandemics now are intricately related to the ways in which we grow our food, the ways that we interact with the land and the environment around us, and the frequency and means by which we engage in global travel and trade. So I think that globalization is characteristic of the pandemic that we are seeing now.
So you're saying that even though the disease is like an act of nature, that what has turned it into a global pandemic has been like the social factors of globalization, and that's how it has spread to most countries in the world. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. But I do think that we are facing this question of what does the future of globalization look like? So, for example, we can see a locking down of borders all across the world in response to the pandemic, and now travel is quite difficult. And even in areas where travel is technically possible, there are a new host of requirements, including getting tested before you get to the airport, getting tested after you arrive, in many cases having to quarantine yourself, which restricts who can and who wants to travel. And I think that as we look at the future moving hopefully out of this particular pandemic, we're going to have to understand how are we going to re-engage in the global environment. And I do think there'll be some interesting middle ground questions. For example, if we look at the switch to remote work, which many of us have had to do, it might be the case that many companies see the advantage in keeping all of their workers working from home, not having to invest in office space and to pay for those things, and that this might be the face of the near future.
Well, one thing that we have seen already is the a change or a return to the importance of national borders of the nation state. So within the European Union, within the Schengen border area that had negotiated freedom of travel within it, all the countries now have their different their own national regulations of who is allowed to come in, and European borders that were just largely a formality in previous years are now are now enforced in a new way. And so I think that this is something that's already happened, but I think this is going to be a trend that we're going to see throughout the near future, is that when it's the opposite effect of globalization was in theory reducing or eliminating these boundaries of nation states, and the pandemic is reinforcing them. One other thing that then goes along with that is also happening, but is of particular concern for peace and conflict studies, is then the rise of populism, nationalism, and demagoguery within that.
And how do you see the rise of this kind of more right-leaning approaches and populist political rhetoric being tied to the notion of boundaries and making harder boundaries much more prevalent?
Well, I think it comes to the idea of like the in and out group, right? So you have the national boundaries being like the physical body limits of the whole and pure nation. And so the whole idea of a nation state is born in that idea of There's Enlightenment ideas of a single nation that has a common ethnic um, unity, linguistic unity, and territorial unity. So it means that all these people who share a culture and a language and religion also live in a single confined space, and that's the whole idea of this sort of territorial nation state. And so that then means that people that don't belong to that group are othered and excluded. And then, especially if you have this idea of that as being like the body of like a physical body, like we are the head and heart of this nation, and then we have this metaphor, but also the real idea of this virus attacking the body. The rhetoric then is to close down those parts of the body, push out anything that doesn't belong to that image of the body of the nation, and so that's the kind of thing that we see. That's what populism is that
Right.
it's othering and demonizing those who are different from the dominant culture as a political expedient to have a scapegoat or someone to blame to all the ills of the society.
And I think that we can see this same influence of political self-understanding in a way, reflecting the different approaches to how governments and cultures deal with the pandemic and the response. As you mentioned in the beginning, there seems to be a division in the world between individualist approaches and collectivist approaches to the pandemic. And I think that this is a topic that can be really broken down into a lot of areas. And if I just use the US as an example, I think that this explains a lot of the tension that we've seen in the US, especially regarding the politicalization of wearing a mask or of the lockdown and pandemic control measures, is that it represents a deeper tension and an unresolved one in the US between like the difference between state rights and the federal government's rights and responsibilities, but also where the individual is located in that. And that it seems very antithetical for some people in the United States that your government can tell you what to wear, for example. I mean, in a way also that the government tells you many things you have to do, like you have to wear clothes to go outside in most places. So it's been interesting to see how these issues are negotiated along, even within the individualist frame, at the levels of individual and the state and the federal level. And what would you think that a more collectivist approach to addressing the pandemic has looked like?
Well, I mean, I think it's a little bit cliche to say, but especially early on, and also like now we can see some kind of broad strokes in the world that, and one of the questions is that is not entirely clear to me at this point, without doing a further research on it, is how much also the factor of democracy versus authoritarian states, where some of the countries that have been very successful were able to have very top-down implementation from the very beginning, and to say like, well, no, we're just closing the borders, so what if the hotels are empty? That's your problem. And they were saving people's lives, and whereas that was not a palatable approach in Europe or in the USA. And I think that like this question of individualist versus collectivist is an essential question to everything that comes out of this pandemic right now, and that is like if you're talking about something like how do I react to the pandemic, and what are the things that I do? Now, do I do them for my own benefit? And this is individual and rights based. Like you can't tell me what to do. I don't need to wear a mask. Or am I doing it for a collective benefit? Am I doing it for other people? And now that's so something like this kind of insane debate in the USA about wearing a mask. Of it can be quite simply explained and justified from a collectivist perspective. Like we all do this so that everybody is better off. We all make this one small sacrifice and everybody benefits. And that's like the basic collectivist approach. right? You sacrifice the rights of the individual, or like you sacrifice something of the individual for the collective benefit.
Mm-hmm.
And then, putting the rights of an individual is like, well, I can choose what to do. You can't tell me what to do. It's like, well, that's putting the rights of the individual center, and then what suffers? The collectivist. The collective suffers for that. And I do find, in my own experience, like right now, I'm a Canadian citizen. I live in Canada. At the beginning of the pandemic, I was in East Asia. I was still living in Korea, and I my contract ended, and I just got out at that time. So I have had this not just a singular experience of living within the kind of the pandemic, and what I've been experiencing recently does give me this idea that there is this quite a palpable onus on the individual of saying this is your personal responsibility. And this is not surprising because it does go hand in hand with kind of larger narratives of like kind of the social contracts. Let's say, like, if you're poor, it's like, well, that's your fault. I mean, that's not a belief that everybody subscribes to, but I think it is something that's very much a common and dominant idea that's in the public psyche of North America, and possibly a lot of other places too. That forget about structural, systemic and structural boundaries or that limitations. That no, it's your fault. You're lazy. You're not working hard enough. And then something like you come to conflict. Well, you are not using your skills well enough. You're not. It's all based on you. You're not communicating clearly enough. If you're stressed at work, it's not because you're in an exploitative system. It's because you're not practicing mindfulness enough. Yeah. So there's all this like downloading onto this individual responsibility, which both obfuscates and legitimizes these large systems of oppression. And so I think this focus on the individual actions, so mask wearing, etc., things like that, it diverts attention from the larger government, institutional, or collective strategies or failures to mitigate the virus or the pandemic. So, for example, if you think of countries like New Zealand is a great example that has very little transmission or cases of COVID-19 right now. Vietnam and Taiwan would also so I think those are good examples of countries that had strong collective implementation right from the beginning, and just stopped it there. And of course there's all kinds of individual actions that are taken throughout there, but right off the top there is organized governmental collective action that prevents the virus from getting a toehold in the territory at the very beginning.
So it seems like it's an interaction of a collectivist orientation politically paired with the ability of top-down structures within that politics to operate.
Yeah. I mean, we could go on and on about this topic. I think there's a lot of material here. And I think one of the fears that we see in places like Europe and North America that is like a backlash against these kind of like strict measures from the government is that's seen as the thin end of the wedge. It's the slippery slope of government control, and that there's a history that if you give governments and institutions some form of power, they never give it back. They don't cede it. Once the emperor gets powers from the republic, you're not going to turn it back into a republic again. So
and there is also a long history, if we look throughout the history of pandemics and politics, where pandemics are used as opportunities to consolidate political power. And that has seemed to be a trend throughout time. And I think consciously or not, that there is a bit of that fear shaping how people react to that. And what I think
Well,
is,
and that's the whole thing, is
yeah,
that it's justified,
yeah,
right? It's not just some kind of conspiracy theory.
yeah,
Well, the government is going to take away our freedoms. Like you said, this is a historical trend.
yeah,
Crises are always times for the strong to consolidate power,
right,
and so it's a very crucial time,
yeah,
and and this is the thing, and I don't want to pour gas onto like conspiracy theories, but
right.
this is exactly the issue, is that it's a very dangerous time for governments and corporations and anybody with power and some nefarious intent
Hmm.
to consolidate that power and to be in a very firm position to not give it back for a long time. So I think people need to be really vigilant right now.
It's quite interesting when we can ask the question of what kinds of lenses should we use to understand the pandemic, but there's also a way in which we can see the pandemic as a lens reflecting back on ourselves, also in a way which it becomes a type of mirror. And we see that through some of the social and political events that have happened during the pandemic really are just shining the light on long existing fault lines of either social injustice, economic injustice, cultural injustice, that are further triggered by the pressure of the pandemic. And I think that we can see this in all of the protests in the United States, protesting for defunding the police or security reform in the US, particularly in regards to the police killing of unarmed black people. And I think that as we go around the world, many of the reactions we see are actually things that have been there for a long time, which have been given a little bit more fuel added to the fire to really come back out into the open.
And just on the last like rant I went on, I thought I should have name check like Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine.
Yeah.
I mean, because that is a great description of how in recent times the most or more recent manifestations of this ancient trend of consolidating power in times of crisis, and then how it's actually been happening in the United States with, what was it, like the war in Iraq and Hurricane Katrina, and these are just like the latest kind of manifestations of this age-old, I don't know, doctrine,
Right.
or like historical pattern. Yeah. But you're talking about like how has this pandemic like exacerbated existing fault lines and failings of society, and there are so many that you pointed out, like race and economic, labor and
And I
access to
think that
healthcare
we're going to be running into a few new ones. We can already see from a recent scan of the news. Now that the vaccine looks like it's going to be possible, we have the question about access to the vaccine and how that relates to social justice, how that relates to global justice. Will developing nations have equal access to the vaccine as the rich nations do? Will there be opportunities for, will there be a private market for the vaccine so that will allow the rich to get vaccinated before the poor? And all of these issues, which we've seen time and time again manifest in different situations, come back again on the stage of the pandemic.
And I think something very simple of like this divide between like working from home, was like in a very kind of white collar, kind of privileged, university educated class of the society, like well, like you and I are able to do, versus the people that don't have the opportunity to work from home, like all the say low end workers. I think this is a great example of something like Amazon and delivery. If you have like this one class of people in society saying like, oh, that's okay, I can work from home. Well, that's great, but then order all kinds of things on Amazon. But that means that there is this large underclass of people that is still out there working and moving things around, putting they're more at risk if they're driving things around on scooters or working in a warehouse fulfilling the wishes of this of class of people that have the luxury of staying from home and telecommuting and working online and then video conferencing. And so, and again, this is just kind of like this classic Marxist, or perhaps more like neo-Marxist argument that has, I think, has been kind of brushed aside by the triumph of neoliberal free market ideology. Is like, well, this is just kind of part of the system, and but now I think the pandemic, we're talking about how it's exacerbated the fault lines. It's like, well, this is a huge problem, and then tying that into how in the USA health insurance is tied to employment. Well, then if you have like millions of people unemployed and there's, because of a pandemic, it's like, well, it's a double shot.
Yeah.
And then so that makes, then all of a sudden this idea that seemed like a great idea under the flourishing of this free market capitalist model then becomes like totally insane. Like, well, like, how did we think this was a good idea? Because when you need it the most, it is when it totally collapses, and it makes the case for a socialized medicine, which most people, most places in the world consider a good idea.
Yeah, and I think in the same way that the pandemic has reflected a history of underlying tensions, and also shows a history of the ability of disastrous scenarios to allow for the consolidation of state power or corporate power, we can also look into the history, both ancient history and near history, of pandemics, to look at where there are also opportunities for cooperation or perhaps peace building within that framework. So what we loosely call the possibility of a pax pandemica, like where is there opportunities for peace building within this pandemic? And I think that this was a question that was really on the minds of peace builders the moment the pandemic really came into the forefront. If we look into the relatively recent history, during the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union did collaborate together to develop and to improve the polio vaccine, which is quite a remarkable thing to remember that happened. Even during the time of utmost paranoia and mistrust, there was still a recognition that there was this problem that required cooperation to work on.
I was just going to say that this is also one of the things that is a good example of the successes of the global collectivism, the successes of the United Nations apparatus, is the eradication of smallpox and near eradication of polio.
Yeah,
I believe it's still like Afghanistan that is not been given like the WHO stamp,
right?
And like some places, parts of northern Pakistan, but or I might be wrong about that. But that this is a great success story of the UN and the organs of global cooperation.
Yeah, and I think it's good to as much as it's easy to get on focusing on the negatives, of which there are many. These stories are important to remember because we see that there is possibilities there. And on a more regional level, there have been examples of cooperation of actually belligerent parties in disease surveillance, detection, and response in the Mekong Basin, in the Middle East, and in East Africa, most recently with the SARS outbreaks, and that you had actual networks of disease surveillance built by groups that were in current active armed conflict with each other, which is quite remarkable. And at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw many single instances of this. For example, the United Wa Army, which is a non-state ethnic armed group in Myanmar, assumed the responsibility for delivering COVID-19 aid to extremely rural communities because they had the infrastructure built up in order to be able to access these communities. So it's quite strange when you see this in many different cases where an armed group then becomes the provider of the pandemic assistance, even working in collaboration with the government with whom they are in an ongoing peace process. And at least in the initial months of the pandemic, we saw that the Saudi-led coalition announced suspension of military operations in Yemen, and Israel and Hamas began negotiations for a prisoner swap in light of the COVID pandemic. We're still looking to see how that actually plays out as time evolves. But I think one of the great examples of the intersection of a peace process and a large-scale disaster is the 2004 tsunami in Aceh in Indonesia. Is that in the midst of a long, protracted civil war, in the midst of a peace process, we had the tsunami and it killed upwards of 500,000 people just in that region alone. And it really catalyzed the peace agreement between the government and GAM.
Yeah, and this is one of the kind of base theories of like, say, peace studies, is that what something that can unite people of different sides of a conflict is some kind of superlative goal. So something that is bigger and beyond the two parties, and then they're forced to work together to work on that. And yeah, and I think it's a common experience that people can relate to. If there's a disaster in your neighborhood, and people put aside the animosities with their neighbors to work together for this common goal. And this is the kind of appeal of alien invasion movies, right. Because it's the only metaphor left,
right.
that is able to unite the people of the world, in some kind of Independence Day style speech of the United States of the world, I think is what they said in the to fight against this external threat.
Especially if we look at the very beginning of the pandemic, around January through April, as we are starting to see the scale, scope, and speed of the pandemic, that there was this question of, well, is it going to be a common enemy that unites us, as the alien invasion example is, or is it going to go the other way? And in April, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for a ceasefire in all ongoing conflicts, precisely because of this question. And he went to the Security Council and he brought up a few of his concerns, which I thought were quite interesting to look at. He feared that there may be an erosion of trust in public institutions, as some governments fail to really provide an effective response. And anytime you feel that your government is failing in that regard, and the undermining of trust becomes problematic, that the economic fallout, which we're only beginning to understand, is going to be a major stressor, especially in fragile societies, and it will likely have a particularly strong impact on women, who make up a majority of the economic sectors that are strongly affected in those fragile societies.
This brings up a point that is maybe a kind of conclusion discussion, is in this idea of the Pax Pandemica and the existing fault lines of north-south and rich-poor, is, will there be a global effort and generosity on the part of the parties that own the rights and the distribution of vaccines to mount a global vaccination campaign, to provide it at cost or as a gift to the people of the world. And this ties into this question of humanitarian aid. Most of the so-called donor nations are running huge deficits just to keep their own the kind of social programs of their own countries alive. Yeah. And so there's a number of questions there about, well, what's going to happen? How are these countries going to react? What is the future of international aid? And what are your initial thoughts on that as a way of tying everything up here?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about how to see if the fears will be fulfilled, that as there are economic contractions in the OECD countries, and pushing many more people into poverty around the world, especially in places like Africa, that there is a fear that these short-term contractions will lead to a longer-term recession, and the current projection is a drop of $25 billion in global expenditure in overseas assistance by 2021, and how that manifests in ongoing peace processes and other programs like that is yet to be seen. And on the question of vaccines, which I don't have any numbers on this, but just what I've seen recently is that we might see what you call vaccine diplomacy. So countries like China, for example, look like they're poised to take a leading role in providing vaccines to Africa as a way of either furthering the relationships that they have in the continent in order to build a stronger working relationships with these countries. And it'll be interesting to see how
retaining vassal states.
Right. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in response to how the United States and the European Union engage with the same question. I think that one of this is an issue that we could talk about at length for quite a while, and maybe we'll end up coming back to it again. But I think that as peace researchers and peace workers, it's an important thing to keep an eye on and to continue reflecting on, because of course we are living in the middle of it right now. And that if you look at the data on predicting pandemics, it's highly likely that in our lifetime we'll see another one again, and probably a much more dangerous one. And so the question will be, how do we capture what we can learn both from our successes and failures in responding to this pandemic in regards to peace and conflict, and how do we work with what we learn from that as we look forward into the medium to long-term future?
Right. This is a good point of thinking, like, well, how do we learn lessons, but also how do we keep them in mind? I think one of the things about the echoes of the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic is that it's not in living memory. The people that lived through that have just faded from our living memory, and so it's not present in people's minds, even though so many of the things are parallels and echoes of the past. And I think that one of the things throughout East Asia that enabled people to have a quick response was the fact that they had lived through the SARS epidemic and had recent memory of how painful and traumatic and scary that was, and had therefore planned for a quick and effective response.
So I think what we've done today is we've given kind of an as it is evolving look at what a peace studies perspective could be on the issue of peace, pandemic, and conflict. Particularly, we focused on the influence of globalization, how that has affected the pandemic, and also how understandings of the individual, the state, and the global system and the relationships within those have shaped both the responses and the reactions to the COVID pandemic. And we've looked at how the pandemic has exacerbating existing social cultural tensions, and also the ways in which our own deep social and political beliefs shine light on how we understand the pandemic. And finally, we looked at this question of the Pax Pandemica, which we won't be able to have an answer for yet, the question of will there be more peace through the COVID pandemic? And are there things that we can learn about building peace in the context of an ongoing, evolving global disaster? Or will it end up having a deleterious effect on peace processes and peace processes around the world?
With that, we'll wrap it up for today. Thank you, Noah. Thank you, all of our viewers, for joining us with this.
Thank you for joining us on this episode, and we hope you tune in for the next one.